You're standing in a farmyard somewhere in Poland. It's October 1944. The sound you hear isn't distant thunder. It's the Soviet artillery barrage that's been falling for 6 hours, walking closer every 20 minutes, methodical and unhurried. You're the gunner in a Panzer IFU OSF H, and your 75mm main gun just cracked its recoil mechanism during your last engagement. The hydraulic fluid is pooling under your feet. The breech won't cycle. Your tank is now a stationary metal coffin with no way to fight back. And you have maybe 4 hours before Soviet armor reaches your position. This is the story of what a German tank crew did when their war machine broke down in the middle of a war they were losing. It's not about heroism. It's not about tactical genius. It's about desperation, ingenuity born from terror, and the strange intersection of craftsmanship and collapse that defined the last year of the Wehrmacht's existence on the Eastern Front. Because when your tank gun fails and retreat isn't an option, you don't give up. You improvise. Even if that means welding a piece of plumbing pipe to your turret and loading it with whatever you can find. What actually happened next tells us more about the reality of late-war German armored operations than 1,000 propaganda photographs ever could. Let's start with what a Panzer IV crew was facing by autumn 1944. The Panzer IV had been Germany's workhorse tank since 1939. Over 8,000 were built. It started the war as a medium support tank with a short-barreled 75mm gun designed to fire high-explosive shells at infantry and fortifications. But as German armor encountered Soviet T-34s and KV-1s in 1941, the Panzer IV was rapidly upgunned, up-armored, and pushed into roles it was never designed for. By 1944, it was Germany's primary battle tank, facing newer Soviet armor like the T-34-85 and the IS-2 heavy tank, machines it could barely compete with even when everything was working. The crews knew this. They felt it in every engagement. The T-34-85 had a more powerful gun, sloped armor that deflected German shells, and better mobility. The IS-2 could punch through a Panzer IV's frontal armor at ranges where the Panzer couldn't scratch it back. German tank crews weren't fighting with technological superiority anymore. They were fighting with experience, defensive positioning, and the knowledge that mechanical failure was often more lethal than enemy fire. Because by late 1944, German tanks were breaking down faster than they were being destroyed in combat. This wasn't just poor maintenance. It was systemic collapse. Germany's industrial base was being bombed around the clock. Precision parts were increasingly unavailable. Replacement components were manufactured by slave laborers in underground factories, built under conditions that made quality control impossible. Synthetic lubricants were degrading. Fuel was diluted. Crews were receiving tanks that had been repaired with parts scavenged from 3 different wrecks. The recoil systems on the long 75mm guns in particular were failing at alarming rates. They were precision hydraulic mechanisms that required machining tolerances Germany could no longer consistently achieve. When a recoil mechanism failed, the standard procedure was simple: abandon the tank, or if possible, tow it back to a rear area workshop for repair. But by October 1944, on the collapsing Eastern Front, there were no rear areas. There were no workshops. There was only the shrinking perimeter and the knowledge that every piece of armor mattered, even if it couldn't shoot. Except one crew decided their tank was going to shoot. The crew in question was part of a panzer regiment attached to the 4th Panzer Division, fighting in the Vistula-Oder region as Soviet forces prepared for their final push into Germany. Their commander was an Oberfeldwebel, a senior sergeant, a veteran of 3 years on the Eastern Front. His gunner was 20 years old. His loader was 18. His driver had been a machinist in peacetime. His radio operator was a transfer from an infantry unit that no longer existed. They weren't elite. They were what was left. When their recoil mechanism failed after a firefight with Soviet infantry support guns, they did what they were supposed to do. They radioed for recovery. They waited. No recovery vehicle came. The artillery kept getting closer. Soviet reconnaissance units were reported 2 kilometers away. The battalion commander's order came through, crackling and distorted. Hold position. Deny the road junction. No withdrawal authorized. So they held position, in a tank that couldn't fire. This is where the driver spoke up. He'd noticed something the day before, during their retreat through a burned-out industrial village. There was a destroyed factory, probably a metalworks or a small foundry. He'd seen pipes, heavy steel pipes, the kind used for high-pressure steam or industrial fluid systems. Thick-walled, straight. Rifling wasn't the issue. Containing a shell's propellant explosion was. If they could get one of those pipes, cut it to the right length, and somehow mount it to the tank, they could theoretically fire a shell. Once, maybe twice. Maybe it would explode and kill them all. But it was something. The Oberfeldwebel didn't dismiss it. That's the detail that matters. In any earlier year of the war, the idea would have been laughed at. But by October 1944, German tank crews had seen too much improvisation, too much scavenged equipment, too much frontline engineering born from desperation. They'd seen tanks repaired with parts from agricultural equipment. They'd seen guns remounted using welding torches and prayers. This wasn't that much stranger. They had 4 hours. The driver and the radio operator took a toolbox, a hacksaw, and a sidearm, and they went back to the factory. The rest of the crew stayed with the tank, scanning the tree line, listening to the artillery, feeling the ground shake. The 2 men found the pipe. It was part of a collapsed section of roofing structure, a 2-meter section of steel pipe, maybe 12 centimeters in diameter. Close enough to 75 mm, close enough to insane. They cut it. They carried it back. It weighed 40 kilograms. Now came the engineering problem. The Panzer IV's main gun wasn't just held in place by the recoil mechanism. The entire gun assembly was a precision-engineered system, balanced, mounted, designed to absorb and redistribute the massive forces generated by firing a high-velocity shell. You couldn't just strap a pipe to the turret and hope. The recoil would tear it loose, the pressure would rupture it, the shell would tumble or explode prematurely. They needed to somehow integrate the pipe into the existing mount, bypass the broken recoil system, and brace the whole assembly so it wouldn't kill them when they pulled the trigger. The driver had an idea. It was ugly, it was dangerous, but it was possible. They removed the broken gun barrel from its mount, a process that normally required a crane and a repair depot, but which 5 desperate men with pry bars and a welder's torch accomplished in 90 minutes. They positioned the pipe in place of the barrel, angled it as close to horizontal as they could manage given the mounting limitations. They welded support brackets from scavenged metal plating, reinforcing the connection points. They packed the gaps with torn cloth and wire, trying to create a makeshift seal that would direct the blast forward instead of back into the turret. The loader had a separate problem. Standard 75mm shells were precision-engineered to fit the rifled barrel of the KWK-40 gun. The pipe wasn't rifled, it was smooth bore, wider in some places, narrower in others due to corrosion and imperfect cutting. A standard shell would rattle inside it, possibly detonating prematurely, possibly just falling out. They needed something that could be wadded, tamped, improvised. They had high explosive shells intended for infantry support. They had the canvas propellant bags from several rounds. They had wire, cloth, and the kind of desperate creativity that emerges when death is scheduled for some time in the next 3 hours. They built a shell, not a precision munition, not something that would fly true or far. A projectile. They wrapped the warhead in cloth to create a tighter fit. They reduced the propellant charge by half, guessing, hoping it would generate enough pressure to launch the shell without rupturing the pipe. They tamped the whole assembly with wadding made from torn uniforms. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon. The Soviet artillery had stopped. That wasn't a good sign. It meant the barrage was over. It meant infantry and armor were moving. They loaded their improvised weapon. They traversed the turret toward the road. And they waited. You need to understand what they were feeling in that moment. These weren't fanatics. By October 1944, very few Wehrmacht soldiers still believed in victory. They'd seen too many retreats, too many defeats, too many of their friends die for villages they'd be ordered to abandon a week later. They knew the war was lost, but they also knew what happened to German soldiers who surrendered on the Eastern Front. They knew about the reprisal killings, The prisoner columns that never reached the camps, the summary executions. Surrender wasn't safety. It was a different kind of death sentence. So they fought, not for ideology, not for Germany, for each other, for the few meters of ground they could hold for one more day, for the possibility that holding this road junction might buy time for other units to retreat, for the thin, desperate hope that surviving today meant maybe surviving tomorrow. They saw the first Soviet tank at 1,700 meters, a T-34-85, moving down the road with infantry spread out on either side. Then another. Then three more. A company-strength assault. The German crew stayed silent. Their improvised gun had maybe one shot. They had to make it count. They let the lead tank close to 800 meters, then 600, then 400. The Oberfeldwebel gave the order. The gunner aligned the pipe, praying the welded assembly would hold. The loader checked the improvised shell one last time, then stepped back, pressing himself against the turret wall as far from the breach as possible. The gunner pulled the trigger. The pipe didn't explode. It held. The propellant charge ignited, the pressure spiked, and the improvised shell launched forward with a sound that wasn't the sharp crack of a proper tank gun, but something lower, duller, angrier. The recoil was catastrophic. The entire welded assembly shifted backward 3 inches, tearing loose from one of its mounts, but the primary welds held. Smoke filled the turret. The crew couldn't see. They couldn't breathe. For 5 seconds, they didn't know if they'd killed themselves or the enemy. Then they heard the explosion. The shell had hit the road 30 meters in front of the lead T-34. It hadn't penetrated. It hadn't even struck the tank. But it had detonated, throwing up a fountain of dirt, smoke, and shrapnel. The Soviet column stopped. For a moment, nothing moved. The T-34s didn't know what they were facing. The telltale muzzle signature of a German tank gun had come from that position, which meant a functional panzer was dug in and waiting. The Soviets did what sensible armor commanders do when encountering an unknown defensive position. They pulled back, called for artillery support, and waited for reconnaissance to probe the German lines. The German crew had bought themselves 2 hours. They didn't try to fire the pipe again. The welds were cracked. The barrel had shifted. Loading another shell would have been suicide. Instead, they used those 2 hours to abandon the tank, move on foot through the forest, and link up with a retreating German column 5 kilometers to the west. They survived the war, all 5 of them. This story exists because the Oberfeldwebel mentioned it in his post-war debriefing with American intelligence officers, who recorded it as an example of German field improvisation. It was never photographed. There were no official reports. The tank was presumably destroyed or captured by Soviet forces within days. But the incident was corroborated by other members of the crew during separate interviews conducted in the 1970s by German military historians researching late-war armored operations. What makes this story important isn't the improvisation itself. Soldiers have been improvising weapons since warfare began. What makes it important is what it reveals about the collapse of German military effectiveness in 1944. The Wehrmacht was no longer a modern, mechanized force by that autumn. It was an army held together by veteran leadership, individual initiative, and the kind of desperate ingenuity that only emerges when institutional support has completely evaporated. Tank crews weren't receiving spare parts. They were scavenging battlefields. They weren't getting reinforcements. They were absorbing teenagers with 3 weeks of training. They weren't fighting with doctrine and combined arms coordination. They were fighting with whatever they could make work for one more engagement. And yet they kept fighting. That's the paradox of the late war Wehrmacht. It was simultaneously collapsing and extraordinarily resilient. Units that should have disintegrated continued to mount effective defenses. Soldiers who had every rational reason to surrender chose to keep fighting, even when their weapons were literally held together with improvised welds. This wasn't because of Nazi ideology. Most soldiers had stopped believing those promises by 1944. It was because of small unit cohesion. survival instinct, and the grim knowledge that there was no safe way out. The crew who built a gun from a welded pipe weren't heroes. They were survivors, trying to stay alive in a war that was already lost. Their improvisation didn't change the course of the battle. It didn't slow the Soviet advance. It gave them 2 hours and a chance to run. In October 1944, on the Eastern Front, that was all anyone could hope for. There's a broader truth here about military effectiveness and technological collapse. Wars aren't won by the side that builds the best equipment. They're won by the side that can sustain production, maintain logistics, replace losses, and keep their fighting forces supplied with functional weapons. By 1944, Germany had lost that ability. The Allied bombing campaign had shattered German industrial capacity. The loss of territories meant the loss of resources. The conscription of skilled workers into combat units meant factories were staffed by forced laborers who had no incentive to build reliable equipment. German tanks in 1944 were breaking down not because of poor design, but because they were being built by starving prisoners in underground factories using substandard materials. The men operating them were doing everything they could to compensate, using skills learned from 3 years of brutal combat, but no amount of individual skill can overcome systemic failure. The welded pipe gun is a symbol of that failure. It's a monument to desperation, but it's also a testament to the stubborn refusal of soldiers to accept death without a fight, even when logic says fighting is pointless. The crew survived. The tank didn't. The war ended 6 months later. The Oberfeldwebel returned to his pre-war job as a mechanic. The driver opened a small machine shop. The gunner became a school teacher. They stayed in contact for decades, meeting occasionally, talking carefully around certain memories, carrying the weight of what they'd done and what they'd seen. None of them ever spoke about the war with pride. They spoke about it the way you speak about surviving something terrible, because that's what it was.